morning, everyone. Hey, if you have a Bible or a device, will you open with me to John chapter 19? John chapter 19, verse 1 will be there in just a moment. I am not the interim. I am just a lowly servant to you this morning. Driving from Queensland, leaving my wife and children behind to come hang out with you for a little bit. They couldn't be with us. I have a daughter who just turned 3 on Friday, so we had a very Frozen-themed birthday this last weekend. Those of you who have been there, you know. And I have a 1.5-year-old son, and so this falls right in nap time range for me and for my wife. And so my wife is home with our children. She has a counseling practice in Calgary called Garden Counseling Services, and so we split our time, both of us, between working. I do sort of biblical, theological, and pastoral studies, and my wife is a therapist, and then we both spend time with our children. So from 2 to bedtime tonight after I'm with you, I'll be hanging out with my little minions and loving on them. Happy Father's Day, whether you are a physical father or a spiritual father. Just grateful for the fathers of the church and the ways in which followers of Jesus are being raised up even here in this community. So John chapter 19, then. You've been in the midst of a series on John's gospel, I think for quite some time. I couldn't piece it all together, but we're going to kind of jump back into the narrative this morning as we're coming close to the end of John. Pretty soon, you will be finished with John's gospel, not with your lifetime, but in this sermon series. And if you remember from the gospel narrative, pressures have kind of been mounting throughout the gospel. If you've read the gospels recently, you would remember that there's a lot of pressure that starts getting put on Jesus and his disciples about midway through the narrative. And it was 8 chapters ago in your series that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And it was in that moment that the chief priests and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, they got together for kind of one single unifying purpose. It's like a bunch of different denominations of Christians getting together and somehow agreeing on one thing. Are you with me? Near impossible, but this group agrees upon one thing: Jesus has got to go. He's gained favor with the crowds, his popularity has grown, and his reputation was spreading, and they feel as though if they allow him to continue on this trajectory, all would come to believe in him, and the Romans would come and take away their place and their nation. In other words, these religious folk, they feared losing their place in their nation, and they were suspect of Jesus and his abilities. They wanted the crowds to be dispersed, his popularity to be diminished, and on one level, they wanted his reputation to be tarnished. They just wanted to put an end to whatever it was that Jesus was doing because he was gaining too much popularity. And at a key moment, 8 chapters ago, Caiaphas, the chief priest at the time, he, being a kind of pragmatic political type, said to the gathered people, "Listen, you don't know anything. Listen, it's of advantage to us that one person should die rather than our entire nation perish." Caiaphas speaks better than he knows here. And so it was from that day forward, midway through John's gospel, that these folk resolved to kill Jesus. And then you had a very long section of sermons on these farewell speeches that Jesus gives. Chapters kind of 13 all the way to 17. Jesus is with his disciples in a kind of contained location as pressures are mounting from the outside. And then last week, Colin took you through John chapter 18 that is full of betrayal and a kangaroo court, numerous denials from Jesus' closest followers, and then arrogant indifference from this political puppet that we know as Pilate. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus was composed, and he was steadfast, and he was unwavering. As Jesus stood at the center of chaos, evil, and injustice, he was calm and composed because he was fixed on the one thing that he was called to do. Jesus was about his Father's work. Are you with me? He knew the task that was set before him, and so he walked faithfully through these circumstances. Jesus, our model, whom we are called to follow, he stood in the midst of the running and the lashing out and the betrayal and the accusation and all the shoulder shrugging. And now this morning, we're kind of on the edge of what we know as the crucifixion narrative, but what Jesus calls his hour of glory. John chapter 12, verse 23. The moment where he's going to be lifted up and draw all humanity unto himself. We're reaching the moment that the gospel narrative has been pushing us towards. And next week, Corey is going to cover the crucifixion itself. But before we get there, I just want to spend a couple of minutes looking at this kind of lengthy final scene that's going to frame the crucifixion or the passion narrative for us. And so I have 3 big points this morning, a bit of a roadmap. We can throw them up here if you're a note taker. First, I want to talk for a few minutes about Jesus' coronation as king. And then I want to talk about asserting human authority in the face of divine authority. And then I want to talk about our wavering faith, or if I could put it a little bit more politically, our wavering allegiances. So first, if you're taking notes, Jesus' coronation as king, John chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate had Jesus taken and flogged. Maybe your translation says whipped or scourged. And having plaited a crown of thorns, the soldiers placed it upon his, that is Jesus' head. And they dressed him in a purple cloak, and they kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking him. Verse 4, Pilate went outside again and said to them, that is the Jewish people, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no case against him. So Jesus came outside wearing the crown of thorns and the purple cloak, and he, that is Pilate, said, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the guards saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and you crucify him, because I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "Listen, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." And so here now in John's gospel, the scene shifts again, and we move back into Pilate's residence, the praetorium. And it's there that the soldiers, they whip Jesus. They take Jesus, they sexually humiliate him by stripping him of his clothing. They tightly bind his arms around a post, and then they savagely beat him with a whip. Scourging or flogging was not an uncommon practice at this time. Roman citizens could be whipped or flogged after a verdict, but it was also commonly used as a way of interrogating citizens. So maybe Pilate thinks to himself, well, maybe if we give him a good enough beating, he'll admit to what it is that he's done. Maybe if we beat him just a little bit more, he'll admit to the truth of what's going on here. Although, if you remember, Jesus has already confessed to be king. Or maybe Pilate thinks to himself, it seems like this crowd really wants blood. So if I take him and give him a little beating, maybe they'll actually let him go after all, and this whole ordeal can come to an end. I mean, up to this point, Pilate's been indifferent, so maybe he just wants to wash his hands clean of these circumstances, this nonsense, and maybe he thinks if I humiliate him, beat him, and shed a little bit of blood, it will satisfy the accusers. But it's after this beating where things take a more interesting turn for us as readers of John's gospel. See, after the beating, the soldiers then take Jesus and they pay 3 honors to him that are typically reserved for kings or royalty. First, if you notice, they place a crown upon his head. Yes, it's a crown of thorns, but it's a crown. Second, they dress him in a purple robe, a sort of military official royal robe. They put it on him, and notice they keep coming up to him, and yes, they are striking him, but they're saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And on one level, this is cruel mockery. Are you with me? It's nothing more than a kind of sheer irony as they take this wreath and a purple robe and they hail Jesus' divine authority. But on another level, for us today in 2024, as followers of Jesus, this scene is nothing less than the truth couched in bizarre details. This is the center point of this entire narrative. If you remember Colin mentioning this from last week, that the narrative takes a turn here as they crown him and they hail him and they robe him. You see, we should not downgrade these to simple literary events. Because for those of us with ears to hear and eyes to see, we know that this is Jesus' coronation ceremony. Jesus is here now being coronated as Israel's king. And then notice what happens next. Pilate takes Jesus outside, and unlike the other gospel narratives, they don't take the crown off of him and they don't take the robe off of him. And so Pilate brings Jesus out before the Jewish people dressed up as a king. And Pilate says before everyone, "Behold the man." Now that sounds strange to us. We're familiar with "you're the man" type statements. That's not quite what Pilate is doing here. He's not ushering out Jesus and saying, "Look at this guy. You're the man, Jesus. Show them what's up." These words are actually a direct citation from 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 17. And if you remember that story, that's just before the coronation of Israel's first king, Saul. The words actually go this way, 1 Samuel 9, verse 15. "Tomorrow," this is God speaking to Samuel, "tomorrow about this time I will send you to a man from the land of Benjamin, and you will anoint him as ruler over my people Israel. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord answered him, 'Behold the man about whom I said to you, this is the one who will rule among my people.'" And so Jesus comes out of the royal headquarters. He's dressed like a king. He's hailed as a king. And now the words that are being spoken about him are the very words that were spoken about Israel's first ever king. "Behold the man." That's the one. He's the king. This is the one who will rule among my people. And if maybe we could slow down together this morning, OAC, I might ask us to reflect upon our vision or maybe our clarity or our ability to see, because this scene is more than just Jesus being beaten and mocked. At the core, this is Jesus' coronation ceremony before he goes to his throne. In other words, the crown is being put on him, the robe is being put on him, he's being hailed, and soon he will go take his place upon his throne, except his throne is a Roman cross. Doesn't sound like kingship to me. Does it sound like kingship to you? You see, Israel had expectations for kingship. We have expectations for Jesus' kingship. We have a particular vision for what rulership and authority and sovereignty and sitting on the throne should look like. And John invites us to see what we are not actually inclined to see. John invites us to hear maybe what we don't want to hear, and yes, to feel what at times we are reluctant to feel, and to face what we are reluctant to face. This is Jesus' coronation as king. The God of the universe. This is his way. This is the way that he has chosen to be coronated as king of the cosmos. We all have experiences of only seeing things certain ways. Are you with me? I mean, we're limited, aren't we? We have certain perspectives and angles and mindsets that tend to force our perspective. I mean, we're limited and we're finite, and if we're honest this morning, we're kind of frail creatures, and we often lack proper perspective. And if we're honest, maybe if I'm honest this morning, this can become my therapy session with you this morning. I think I want the Jesus of my own imagination at times more than I want this Jesus that's standing before us. I don't want Jesus to do power this way. I don't want Jesus to do authority this way. I don't want Jesus to invite us to suffering this way. I want to see a different Jesus. I want to build a different Jesus. And deep within my heart and mind, it's actually a pretty easy thing to do. To paint a picture of Jesus in my own image rather than the Jesus that is before us here in John's gospel. Rather than the one who lays down his life for the sheep, but more than that, the one whose sheep hear his voice, know his voice, and follow. And the way of following is this way of kingship and rulership. You see, as one of my teachers always used to put it, followers of Jesus follow Jesus. It's just that this seems like a pretty costly way of following. Are you with me? One theologian once put it this way: you cannot be Christ's servant if you're not willing to follow him cross and all. What do you crave? You want a crown? Then you have to wear a crown of thorns if you're to be like him. Do you want to be lifted up? Then you'll have to be lifted up on a cross. And this is obvious, and I think we know this, but I want to give us a very simple reminder this morning. This is what Jesus' kingship looks like. And to use a really fancy seminary Greek term, just for 1 minute, if you'll forgive me, this is an apocalypse. And by that, I don't mean the end of the world, don't worry. We love to use the word apocalypse for this, but the word apocalypsis means to reveal or to unveil or to make clear or pull back the curtain. See, when we look at this coronation ceremony, this is not just Jesus being beaten by a pragmatic Roman official and his cohort of soldiers. This is Jesus legitimately being coronated as Israel's king and the king of the universe. John's gospel here is apocalyptic, and at times, if we're honest, we don't want to see it this way. And it's certainly the case that the chief priests and the guards do not see Jesus here as a real king. See, from their perspective, what's happening here is what Jesus deserves. He needs to be eliminated before more damage can be caused. And you see, they assert to Pilate that they want him to be crucified, but Pilate says to them, I have no case against him. Take him away and do it yourself. I'm not interested in doing your dirty work. Go do it on your own. But according to them, they have a law, and Jesus has broken that law, and so Jesus must die. Now, John doesn't tell us what law it is that Jesus has broken, but it's most likely something like Leviticus 24:16, which says this: whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. The whole community is to stone him. If he blasphemes the name, he is to be put to death, whether the resident is an alien or a native. Now, this is where things take a turn for the interesting, because Pilate, a Roman governor, is not interested in the superstitious laws of a fringe religion. Hence his general indifference to this entire situation. But it's at this moment, when he hears them say these words about why they want to put him to death, Pilate now becomes interested. He made himself out to be the Son of God. And now Pilate's disposition changes from control and indifference to fear and the assertion of his authority, which leads to my second point this morning, that in the face of divine authority, fear often causes us to assert our human authority. John chapter 19, verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he became more afraid. And he went back into the praetorium and again said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, why aren't you speaking to me? Don't you know that I have authority? Notice that language. I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you. And Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all if it had not have been given to you from above. For this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. And so Pilate comes back into his headquarters with Jesus in tow, and we move from indifference to the realization that Jesus may be some type of divine figure, and so Pilate's entire posture changes. Hence, he asks Jesus, okay, wait a minute, where are you from? And if you remember John 18, this question has already been asked. But it's in this moment that Pilate starts to assert his own authority, point to his own power, and state his own sovereignty. Rattled by the fear of the unknown, he tries to cling to his worldly power, arrogantly saying to Jesus, don't you know that I can free you or I can crucify you? Give me the answer to my questions now. He sees the situation slipping from his grasp, and so he tries to assert his own human authority. Fear has this effect, doesn't it? It causes us to try to regain control, wield power, assert our authority. When we feel as though things are slipping from our fingers, or Jesus isn't the right kind of king, the one that we were looking for, and he's not exercising his authority the way that we expected, we start to assert our own human authorities. Are you with me? We want things to go our way. Because often our broken human authority cannot endure the presence of divine authority. Our human power structures can't endure the presence of divine power, and our human attempts to control circumstances cannot endure divine control. And so Pilate asserts his authority, but the veil comes down pretty quick. Are you with me? Because Jesus immediately says to him, listen, these are not coincidental events that are transpiring before you, Pilate. You would have no authority at all if it were not granted to you from above. Jesus lets Pilate know with a kind of unwavering confidence that is so characteristic of John's gospel that you only have authority because it was given to you. These words, if you remember, or if you're a nerd like me, hit your ears a little funny. Jesus says, you would have no authority unless it was given to you from above. And I immediately think of Jesus' interaction with Nicodemus some 16 chapters ago, where Jesus said to Nicodemus, truly I say to you, without being born from above, a person cannot see the kingdom of God. See, Pilate, authority comes from above. The ability to see comes from above. You don't actually have any authority, and you can't actually see what's happening. See, from the opening sections of this gospel, we learn that to see the kingdom of God, we must be born from above. We need to come to possess divine vision, or as Paul puts it in another place, the eyes of our hearts must be enlightened so that we can see through our divine rebirth. And so Jesus pushes back. Listen, Pilate, your authority was given to you from above. You have no authority at all. See, listen, Pilate, your authority doesn't come from your emperor or your nation or your position. And so here now the tables turn and we take on a kind of cosmic perspective. In other words, and I think this is a good reminder for us this morning, that these earthly political issues that we see before us, these earthly political and even religious issues, they are not simply human issues, they're cosmic issues, Jesus said. Pilate, you're caught up in a situation that you don't understand, because this is not about you and me and the religious authorities. Here's what this is about. It's about God and the Satan and the evil forces of the world. Your authority is a human authority. My authority is a divine authority, and my power does not come from the power structures of this world. And so this sort of escalating pattern of indifference that moves to fear, that moves to sort of frantic attempts to regain control, I think this resonates deeply with our human experience, and I think we see from Pilate what any one of us would do in a situation like this. I was indifferent, now I feel some fear, and now I just kind of want to be done with this whole situation altogether. I don't know what's going on here. Things have taken a turn for the strange. You're saying he's a divine figure. I don't know what to do with him. Let's just get rid of him. And so Pilate tries to release Jesus one more time. And that leads to our final point this morning, wavering allegiances. John chapter 19, verse 12. From that moment, Pilate tried to release him, that is Jesus. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself out to be king opposes Caesar. In other words, this is an act of treason. This man has made himself out to be king. When Pilate heard these words, he led Jesus outside and seated him, or was seated, on the judge's bench at the place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. And he, that is Pilate, said to the Jews, here is your king. And they cried, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answer, I'll add here rather chillingly if we're honest, we have no king but Caesar. Then he, that is Pilate, handed over Jesus to be crucified. And so Pilate comes back again with the intention of seeing Jesus released. He moved from indifference to fear, and now he just wants to see this man whom he assumes to be innocent released back. Listen, I don't want to crucify him. I don't want anything to do with this. Take care of it on your own. And then the Jewish people back Pilate into a corner by invoking his relationship to Caesar. They use kind of technical terminology. Are you a friend of Caesar, or are you not a friend of Caesar? It sort of signals the particular relationship that Pilate as a governor would have had with the emperor of Rome. And so now, as Pilate tries to release Jesus, the crowds are depicted as playing on Pilate's political relationship with the suspicious Caesar, who, if we're honest, like most rulers throughout human history, was known to act swiftly and brutally in response to any hint of treason. And so they present Jesus as a rival king, and now Pilate is in a compromised position where he needs to choose between releasing Jesus, which would be perceived as treason, or now just crucifying him. And Pilate plays the political card, as any one of us probably would in a situation like this. And he leads Jesus outside. And we don't know what's happening here. This is really interesting. It's not clear in Greek what's going on. Either Pilate sits down on the judge's bench or he sits Jesus down on the judge's bench. We don't know. But masterful writing has that kind of ambiguity. Are you with me? I think John wants to put in our face just one last time here before Jesus goes to the cross. Who really sits on the judge's bench? Who's really in control? Who really has authority? Is it Pilate or is it Jesus? Who's the real king? Is it Caesar or is it Jesus? Who should we give our allegiance to? Is it Caesar or is it Jesus? And then Pilate says what has already been implicit. Here's your king. And then they say, we have no king but Caesar. I sort of sink down when I hear these words personally. Like when I read the narrative, I'm disturbed by this, not because I don't see the possibility of doing this myself, but it's a pretty disturbing feature of this narrative. The Jewish people, instead of allowing Jesus to be released, they pledge allegiance to their oppressor. They're willing to effectively renounce God in this moment for the pragmatic purposes of eliminating Jesus. And the sad reality is that to reject Jesus, according to John's gospel, is to reject God. And so here now, as they say, we have no king but Caesar as a means to secure Jesus' death, on one level, John wants us to think that they're doing nothing less than renouncing God himself. The language, we have no king but Caesar, seems to be a kind of direct parody of the idea of we have no king but Yahweh. We have no Lord but our God. And the Passover liturgy, the liturgy that they're going to recite very shortly in celebration of the Passover ceremony, the reason why they cannot enter the praetorium is because they want to remain ritually clean to celebrate the Passover. They would have likely recited lines that sounded like these. This is the Nishmat hymn. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Beside you, we have no king, redeemer, or savior, no liberator, deliverer, provider, none who takes pity in every time of distress and trouble. We have no king but you. In other words, here now they stand and say, we have no king but Caesar. And shortly they will go, and at their religious custom ceremony, they'll say once more, we have no king but our God. In other words, the very group that has accused Jesus of blasphemy on one level shows themselves guilty of a type of apostasy by accepting Caesar's exclusive claim to kingship instead of their God. And if I'm honest, I kind of want to balk at their willingness to waver in dedication to their God, to waver in dedication of doing what is right, to play the pragmatic card and to bend a knee to Caesar in order to engage their own, to secure their own agenda. But I think if we're honest, we would say that oftentimes we're willing to do the same. Maybe that's just me this morning. I'm an outsider, so I'll say that's me and it's not you, and we can wink. I think sometimes we'll often make brash claims, we'll pledge our allegiance in different directions, we'll bend our knees to all sorts of political parties and rulers and establishments that deep down we know compromise our worship of God, but often we'll be willing to do it to get the ends that we want. In their minds, the ends justify the means. And in God's economy, the ends actually never justify the means. Are you with me? You see, what the gospel narrative actually teaches us is that the means by which Jesus becomes king, the way that Jesus walks and lives and moves, that's not separated from the ends that he brings. So we'll bend God's commands, sometimes for what is politically savvy, or we'll distort truth for what is culturally expedient, or we'll take the easy way that avoids the way of the cross, or we'll take pragmatism over faithfulness. I think sometimes in our desire to be effective, we fail to be faithful. Are you with me? I want to be effective in my worship of God and the way that I live, and sometimes my attempts to be effective actually hurt my faithfulness. Now, I want to say there's more grace. Are you with me? That actually our wavering allegiances are not determinative of where we land or the holistic nature of our apprenticeship to Jesus. And this kind of thing has actually been happening through all of church history. It was around 250 under Decian persecution where something came up known as the lapsy. If you ever heard that before, that's fine. You can write it down and Google it, or just trust the bald guy at the front as he tells you about the lapsy. In 250, there was a real persecution that broke out. I mean, the church is not very old at this point. We tend to idolize the early church. Like, if we could just get back to how awesome it was then, as though Ananias and Sapphira aren't being slayed on floors and stuff. Like, we have it pretty good. Like, it's not too bad, right? But early on, there were questions like this, yeah? And so there was persecution that emerged among Christians, and the question came up, well, what if we just pledge a little incense to Caesar? Like, what if we just bow the knee? Like, what if some of us just kind of bend our convictions and our faithfulness to Jesus just a little bit in these directions so that we can secure our place? And so one of three things happened. Some people fled and ran. Other people pinched incense and gave worship to the emperor, and others were willing to die for their faith. And here's what gets really interesting. There was a huge debate in the early church once the persecution wore off as to whether or not you welcome back the people who had renounced their faith. And you know what they decided? Of course you do. Of course you do. Of course you do. Our allegiances will waver. What matters is that we keep coming back to Jesus. What I would like to say is, under all the pressures and challenges that we face, that our allegiances will not waver. They probably will, because we're frail human beings that live in a broken world. But we're invited again and again and again to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd and to follow him as he goes the costly way of the cross. And so three things from this section of John that I think set up where the text will take us next week in the crucifixion. First, Jesus' coronation as king. Second, asserting human authority. And third, our wavering allegiances. And so then three things maybe in response to these before we move to communion and the band returns and we go off to drink our dad's root beer. First, I think at every turn we need to slow down. It's a big mantra in our home right now. My 3-year-old and my 1.5-year-old are very proficient at doing many things, and they like to try to do them very quickly. So there's a lot of falling and a lot of getting hurt, and my daughter has really big emotions right now because she hasn't learned emotional regulation yet. Some of you know what that's like in the room. And since she doesn't know, that was a joke, since she doesn't know emotional regulation yet, it's just lots of big feelings. I think sometimes we need to slow down and regain our vision for Jesus. I don't know about you, to use a really kitschy modern term, I tend to colonize Jesus with all sorts of things that I want Jesus to be. Jesus is more like a Rorschach inkblot test, where I'm actually, in looking at Jesus, I'm seeing portrayals of my own psychology more than I'm seeing Jesus himself. And there's something good about that, right? Because when I look at Jesus, I want to see someone that I know and understand and who is like me. That's beautiful. But on another level, that's kind of problematic. Because if I turn Jesus into something that he's not, then he's not really my rabbi, my redeemer, and my savior. He's not my king anymore, but he becomes my subject. And so even as we go to the table in a moment, or as we think about our days together now, I wonder what it looks like to get clarity on Jesus and the way that he becomes king. Second, I wonder what it looks like for us, again, and directly related, to just come under God's authority. We live in turbulent times in our history. Not unprecedented times. I don't want to make it sound like things like these sorts of political upheavals or conspiracy theories or all sorts of things haven't existed before. They certainly have. They're sort of fueled by the internet, but they've existed for a long time. And we don't face unusual circumstances. They're just different because we've never faced them before. And I wonder what it looks like for us in the face of uncertainty and strangeness to not assert our human authority, but to trust in divine authority. If I may be as bold to say, in a season where things are happening in transitions for you here, I wonder what it looks like to trust in divine authority with what happens next. Or as Colin mentioned last week, you are not without a pastor because Christ is the pastor of his church. Or as one theologian once said, "Oh, you poor, poor, pitiful people, you will not save the church. The church will save you because Jesus stands at the center of the church." And then finally, as the band comes back this morning, I wonder what it looks like to pledge allegiance to Jesus once more. To say, wherever I'm at and wherever I've been, maybe you've been a lapsee or someone who's kind of been around, but your allegiances to Jesus have really wavered the last little while. Or maybe you've been steadfast in your dedication to him, or anywhere in between. There's always opportunity to come back and say, Jesus is my king. I follow Jesus because followers of Jesus follow Jesus. See, the gospel invites us to see Jesus, to hear his voice, and to follow him. And we are invited to follow this Jesus, to lay aside our assertions of authority in the face of divine authority and to pledge allegiance to the King of all kings, the King who wears a crown of thorns, who is robed in a purple robe and hailed as the King of the cosmos. And if this seems difficult or challenging, I'm with you. But this is our calling. And if maybe I could quote Chesterton for just a moment. In his book, What's Wrong with the World, he said, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." This is our faith. This is the one whom we follow, the one who goes the costly way of the cross.